Russia overnight launched its long-anticipated attack on Ukraine, striking military posts across the country. An unprovoked war in Europe is now underway. The assault began with an angry message from President Vladimir Putin broadcast in the middle of the night. Russia cannot feel safe, develop, and exist with a constant threat emanating from the territory of modern Ukraine, he said, describing the government in Kiev as a junta of neo-Nazis determined to build nuclear weapons. As Putin spoke, seemingly on cue, Russian bombs started falling. Cruise and ballistic missiles, Ukrainian officials said, along with attack helicopters striking military installations, including air bases near the capital, Kiev. And more military targets in several other Ukrainian cities, including Kharkiv, the biggest city in eastern Ukraine. Russia claimed to have eliminated much of Ukraine's defenses, but the Russian reports appear exaggerated. Several videos showed what Ukrainian officials described as columns of Russian tanks entering Ukrainian territory. A potentially devastating war in Ukraine has just begun. But so far it appears to be a gradual assault. Putin, who said he does not want to occupy the country, may be trying to take Ukraine without having to fight hard for it, appealing to the military not to resist. But there are no signs Ukrainians are raising the white flag. President Zelensky, in a pre-dawn appeal, told Ukrainians to stay strong and calm as he announced the start of martial law. While some Ukrainians in Kiev were heading out of the capital, many are determined to stay and resist. In Mariupol, people this morning were stocking up on cash with long lines at the ATMs. How are you feeling? I'm nervous and I'm trying to keep my children calm, said Yulia.
Putin says he's doing Ukrainians a favor by trying to get rid of their Nazi fascist government. What do you think about that?
We don't need his protection, she said, and dismissed Putin's claims as lies. Supermarkets were flooded too, 45-minute waits for checkout. This is our Ukraine. I'm staying. I'm calm. I'm even smiling, said Ivan. Ukraine has mobilized its forces and begun to defend its cities. The government is calling for urgent blood donations to treat the growing but still unclear number of casualties.
Putin, in his message that launched this military offensive, seemed to have a special message for the United States, reminding the world that Russia is a nuclear power, and said that anyone that tried to stop Russia's actions would face terrible consequences.
As we go to air tonight, Ukraine is under full-scale Russian assault. Explosions and air raid sirens have been heard in several Ukrainian cities, including the capital, Kiev. Russian missiles have blasted air bases and other military assets. The United Nations Secretary-General has begged Russia to withdraw its troops in the name of humanity. And the US President says Vladimir Putin has chosen a premeditated war that will bring catastrophic loss of life.
From the north to the south, Ukraine is under attack. Explosions were heard across the country before sunrise. This photo from the Ukrainian president's office showing an explosion in the capital. As air raid sirens rang out across Kiev, authorities confirmed Russian troops had crossed the border into the country. This video from Ukraine's border guard showing military tanks rolling into Ukraine along its northern border with Belarus. Vladimir Putin delivered this ominous message, seemingly as the first explosion was reported.
Circumstances require firm and immediate action from us. I decided to conduct a special military operation. Anyone who tries to stop us and threaten our country and people should know Russia's response will be immediate and lead to consequences you have never faced in your history. We are ready for any outcome.
The Russian president, who called on Ukrainian troops to lay down their arms, addressed his nation just before 6 a.m. as the United Nations Security Council held an emergency meeting at the request of Ukraine.
I have only one thing to say from the bottom of my heart. President Putin, stop your troops from attacking the Ukraine. give peace a chance.
But it was too late. As morning broke, Ukraine's president declared martial law in the country.
Dear Ukrainians, this morning President Putin announced a special military operation in the Donbass. Russia has carried out strikes on our military infrastructure and border guards. We need each of you to be calm. If possible, stay at home.
I woke up and heard a series of shots. I rushed to the balcony and realised they weren't fireworks. People were running on the street.
Ukrainian tanks were deployed across the country as the nation's leader pledged to take any assault head-on. President Biden also confirming the US will coordinate with its NATO allies to ensure a strong and united response, releasing a statement saying President Putin had chosen a premeditated war and that Russia alone is responsible for the attack. Tens of thousands of Russian and Russian-backed troops are already in the eastern Ukraine regions of Donetsk and Luhansk, but many more are stationed in Crimea in the south and across the border in Belarus, north of the capital. Reports of explosions have been recorded in at least 5 Ukrainian cities, including the capital. Ukraine's airports have also been targeted. The Ukrainian airspace is now closed to commercial flights as shelling continues dangerously near the homes of residents. Ukrainians making a last-minute dash out of the country could have a long journey ahead of them.
And Isabella Higgins is live for us in the city of Lviv in the west of Ukraine. Isabella, many of those people we just saw fleeing the capital are heading to where you are. Is anywhere in Ukraine safe from attack?
Well, Juanita, that's very hard to say. Russia is obviously an incredibly powerful military force. We know that there are tens of thousands of troops on the eastern, northern and southern borders of this country. That's air, ground and sea forces. So while people are making their way here to the west of the country, which feels safer, that includes diplomatic staff, there are reports of shelling in this region not far from where I am here in Lviv. And certainly in this city, there are residents who are taking their own precautions, who are making preparations. There are very long lines for ATMs here as people try to get cash out. We're hearing about residents who are doing emergency firearms training to try and protect themselves. And we also have seen that there are already long lines at the Polish border. So it seems those that can leave Ukraine are choosing to do so.
Isabella, thank you. We'll come back to you shortly.
We're right in the heart of the Ukrainian capital. You can probably hear that air raid siren ringing out across the city. It's the first time we've heard that. Within about 10 minutes of Vladimir Putin's speech, you could hear some explosions. We heard about 4 or 5 in the first hour and then another big one about an hour later. There is generally a sense of calm here, but we are hearing warnings now for people to bunker in. There are shelters underneath the metro here. This city has some of the deepest metros in the world. They were built by the Soviets to withstand a US strike. So people are now having to make those decisions. Do they seek shelter or do they try to get out of the city altogether? Now, the airspace is closed now, so it's going to have to be by road, and with Russia surrounding much of Ukraine, people are going to be heading mostly west to Poland. So a very difficult situation for many Ukrainians waking up. There's been a lot of anxiety over the last few weeks about exactly what a Russian strike might look like, but for many Ukrainians, their worst fears are now being realised.
These are live pictures of the city where it's just past 10 in the morning and -3 degrees.
The UN Security Council hoped war could be averted with words.
There is no purgatory for war criminals. They go straight to hell, Ambassador.
But the pre-written pleas from diplomats were outdated as soon as they were delivered.
We're staring into the abyss of a major conflict in Ukraine, and a conflict that we know would have global implications.
Russia's attack on Ukraine is tantamount to an attack on the UN and every member state in the chamber tonight.
From the Russian representative came an alternate reality.
Those living in Donetsk and Luhansk are still sheltering in basements. The refugees are still flowing into Russia. The nature of the provocation by the Ukrainian military has not changed. You don't want to notice this, repeating the Ukrainian fairy tales.
A first round of Western sanctions failed to halt Russia's invasion plans, including Germany's decision to suspend the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline and American penalties against the company building it.
We have ensured that this is an $11 billion prize investment that is now a hunk of steel sitting at the bottom of the sea.
You're going to toughen up sanctions, Prime Minister?
Threats from London to target Russian banks and oligarchs fell on deaf ears. Boris Johnson tweeted, "President Putin has chosen a path of bloodshed and destruction by launching an unprovoked attack," warning the UK would respond decisively. Tonight, the US president is monitoring developments from the White House, praying, he says, for the Ukrainian people.
For weeks, the United States has been warning of severe and unprecedented consequences if Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine. Those measures are now on the way. Within hours, President Joe Biden will meet with G7 leaders before addressing the nation to announce a new set of sanctions in coordination with Western allies.
A vow to hold Russia accountable for an attack playing out almost exactly as the US had feared.
So, Anita, these new sanctions, and it's just the latest wave and more waves are to come, will target 25 Russians involved in the country's military, 4 entities involved in the supply of weapons, and the Prime Minister has even foreshadowed targeting some 300 members of the country's parliament. To your question, will the Kremlin care what we do? The answer is no, probably not. But
exactly
Scott Morrison and many others here in Canberra believe that Vladimir Putin is trying to overturn the rules that Western countries and the world has lived by for decades, and that the way we respond now could have major ramifications for the way authoritarian countries both in Europe and indeed in our region act in the years and possibly decades to come.
This is a chilling reminder of the world that we live in and where the threats and...
For now, Ukraine really has to stand and face Russia's military might on its own.
And we are monitoring the latest coming out of Kyiv, Ukraine, after Russia this morning. Russian President Vladimir Putin has confirmed that a, quote, special military offensive is underway in Ukraine. Ukrainian President Zelensky saying that this is a full-scale invasion, an invasion coming in from all sides. And I do have a very special guest here with me to help me break down the latest on what we are seeing, what it is that we are monitoring, and how we can really make sense of a very complex situation.
Thanks for having me. I hope you can hear me okay. This is a complete disregard by Putin for international law. It's a complete disregard for the United States and for the West. He doesn't fear anything this president is going to do, meaning President Biden. He's not worried about a NATO response. He's not worried about Europe. And his actions in the early morning hours today demonstrate that. This wasn't about going into these 2 republics. This wasn't about staying in the Donbass region. This was about getting all he can. And this is day 1 of an invasion. And so far, there is no price. And will continue. Russia is acting as an intermediary between the U.S. and Iran in Vienna talks. So that's diplomacy. So on one hand, you had the U.S. relying on Russia in Vienna, yet condemning Putin in Ukraine. And so I think diplomacy should be taken off the table. Anything that Russia's energy sectors touch should be punished with crippling sanctions. Oligarchs should have their properties and bank accounts seized, their visas ended, and they should be expelled from Western countries. Just like he's asking the question, what else do you have? The one thing we do know is that Putin's economy, the stock market lost about 50% of its worth yesterday in Russia. Its economy cannot sustain prolonged combat in Ukraine. Russia cannot continue over time to continue to logistically support these actions in Ukraine, and we need to make it very hard for Putin to do so. We need to sow discontent in Russia, make the economy so bad that the Russian people and even some of his Russian generals say, listen, our commander-in-chief has lost his mind and he is going to end Russia as we know it, financially, economically if he continues to go and kill our relatives in Ukraine, our cousins, our family members. So there's a lot more we can do. And like we talked about last time, Gabrielle, if you go after those closest to Putin and start seizing Putin's money because they are holding Putin's money and Putin's properties, we should be able to see an immense amount of pressure being put on Putin to stop or to have him simply replaced. Putin's very weak right now. He's weak with his generals that don't see this as a good idea. He's weak with the people in Russia. And if he continues this, he's going to put himself in danger, not only from the international community, from the economic consequences, but danger of people replacing him inside of Russia. Anyone who opposes Putin draws huge crowds, and then Putin simply has them exiled or poisoned. So we do know that there's discontent in Russia. We do know that they're rejecting the propaganda that Putin's putting out. You can't call a Russian's cousin in Ukraine a Nazi. You know, the language that he's using, it's almost for Western consumption. You know, I'm going in because they're building a new nuclear program. I'm going in to end the Nazi presence inside of Ukraine. These types of sound bites or these types of narratives are meant for the West. But people reject that because they know Ukraine. It's right there. They are them. And that's not a reason for Putin to go in and seize a country. That's a reason for him not to do it. I do expect the civilians on the ground in Ukraine to fight back. Who would be better at an insurgency against Putin's assets, seizing airfields, and basically targeting the military? Because under international law, you know, the Geneva Convention, the only forces Putin's allowed to target if he invades would be military forces. So that's what he's doing now. We've seen it looks like an effort to avoid civilian casualties. I do believe he's weighing whether or not to actually have a mass casualty producing event. He was able to do it in Syria with impunity. And this will basically put a spotlight on the international community. Why were they okay with Putin killing civilians in Syria? And why are they not okay with Putin killing Europeans in Ukraine? And that's a big problem that the Middle East will be looking at to see what the Western response is to Putin if he starts killing civilians, because he was able to do it with impunity in Syria. So he's weighing those options. So this is about seizing infrastructure, seizing lines of communications, and lines of communications are roads, are highways, are airports, are key terrain. You know, so he's seizing those high value targets, so to speak. And that's the military component of this. And the West is urging Zelensky to get out of Ukraine. I would actually say he needs to stay in Ukraine. There's nothing standing in the way other than a go-to-ground insurgency. If the Ukrainian military simply sheds their uniforms, takes their weapons, goes into buildings and starts shooting Russians as they move by, or planning improvised explosive devices to take out Russian columns, then it would become very bloody very quickly. I do sense that the Biden administration is going to urge Zelensky and his government to leave and become a government in exile. And I believe that just green lights Putin's path all the way into the capital and an actual replacement of the government. You can be a government in exile. We've seen that in Iran. We've seen that in other places, and never come back. So once Zelensky leaves and his government leaves, I think that's a green light to Putin that you can start putting your regime in place. So it happens to be Russian. They know the radar signatures. They know how to identify them. They know what their armored vehicles look like under infrared, radar. So Ukraine's military is suspended in 1990, and it doesn't have any advanced weapons. The United States didn't sell it advanced weapons. They do have anti-tank weapons and javelins, but they don't have an advanced air defense capability. They don't have an advanced armor capability. They do have an anti-armor capability, which goes back to this argument that the best way for them to resist Russia is to shed the uniforms, go into the buildings, use those anti-tank weapons and those that are trained on sniper operations, and start taking out Russians, because the conventional military capability of Ukraine is far less superior. I mean, Russia can overwhelm them. I mean, he's basically warning about a Russian response to any intervention in Ukraine. And, nobody wants that. And Putin knows nobody wants that. He knows it's leverage to be able to use that threat. And he knows the West isn't going to counter or step up. The president needs to come out and be very strong today. Putin has basically laid down the deterrence threat. If you do anything, we have the option to punish you. And he's talking about nuclear capability. And Biden needs to, bring out that Cold War statement about the U.S.'s capability to just devastate Russia, to overwhelm Russia. I mean, it's extinction type of stuff when it comes to what we could do to Russia. Well, we shouldn't even be talking about that. Putin is doing this in real time, not under the cover of darkness, making threats about using nuclear weapons, and we are still worried about whether or not we should sanction his gas and oil sector. I mean, that's why he can use this bravado language, because we won't even use sanctions that would devastate his economy. And he knows that. He knows he can push as far as he wants to, and he doesn't see any strength coming out of this White House.
Well, the White House does have an opportunity to make yet another statement today. President Joe Biden is expected to speak. We are getting word that we are expecting that around 12:30 p.m. Eastern time. As soon as we have that feed, we will bring it to you all live. But Michael, last question for you. Now that the invasion has begun, and I think I asked you this the last time that we spoke, but now that we're in a new phase, each time we speak, it's kind of a new chapter to this story. What is Vladimir Putin's end goal? I mean, is it to rewrite the security architecture of Europe? Is it to turn back the time to Soviet Russia? What is the end goal, and where does this end?
So the strategy is to divide NATO. The strategy is to take back the Ukraine, and then weigh options whether or not he should go into the Baltic states, those new members of NATO. And the strategy, phase one, take back Ukraine. Phase two, see what you can get away with when it comes to the Baltic states. And in those two phases, you have this increasing alliance with China to offset U.S. sanctions. China hasn't condemned Russia's actions. China and Russia have seats on the UN Security Council where they can veto anything strong against Putin. And I just don't think he sees anybody getting in the way. If we allow Ukraine to go unpunished, his actions in Ukraine to go unpunished, and I mean crippling sanctions that make him rethink everything, then he will likely move on the Baltic states. And NATO's already divided. They've already said, they don't know if they'll enact Article 5 to protect Lithuania or some of these other new members of NATO. And Putin's listening and watching. And so now is the time to deter him with crippling sanctions, not deter him from his invasion of Ukraine, but to deter him from continuing his creep across Eastern Europe.
Right, deter him from that potential next step. You spoke about Article 5. Article 4 has been activated. We broke that this morning. So they are going to have an emergency meeting. Jens Stoltenberg did confirm that today. So you're spot on. This is definitely the direction and the fear of the Baltic states, Latvia, Ethiopia, Estonia, I should say, and Lithuania. Those three regions are fearing that they could be potentially next. And Michael, we saw explosions very close to the Polish border as well. So NATO states certainly on high alert. Thank you so much for the insight. I really appreciate it. Always a pleasure speaking to you.